Good evening. Tonight's video explores another round of true horror stories from Reddit, moments of unease, unexplained events, and encounters that don't fade easily. Whether you're relaxing after a long day, drifting toward sleep, or keeping yourself company while working through chores, let these stories unfold in the background. Now, let's begin. I hit someone whilst driving at night. It wasn't human. I had always loved driving at night. When I'd first learnt to drive, I would steal my old man's car and go roaring down the rural back roads early in the morning. It gave me a sense of freedom. I had meant to set off at 8, but instead, I didn't start my long drive back until gone 10. I'd been out of town for a week, meeting some old friends and reliving the past. It was a 7-hour drive down, but that was during the day. Without any traffic, the drive should cut down to around 5 hours, tops. That was another reason I loved driving at night. I was a nervous driver when I was on the open freeway. In those moments, my safety depended on the competence of others, and I just had no faith in the competence of others. That night, I had barely met 2 cars before I had to pull over. The fuel gauge dancing worryingly close to EI turned into a shitty little gas station that was still a few miles out from the edge of town. Some teenagers were working the till. He had school books splayed out on the counter, and he was barely awake. He jumped when I walked in. I bought a packet of apple-flavored gum and put $30 on the tank. I walked out of the artificially lit convenience store and to the darkness surrounding my car. I drove a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. She was my pride and joy. As I gently filled her up, I subconsciously rested my eyes. I jolted back to lucidity just before I fully fell asleep. I realized I had overshot it and went back into the store to pay. The kid was gone, probably on a toilet break, judging from the cans of Red Bull piled around his textbooks, so I left $10 by the register and called it a day. I got back in my car and got ready for the final stretch of the journey. Around 15 minutes later, I passed another car. It was a white sedan, fresh out of the 1980s. It was the type of car I would have whistled at if it drove by me in the street. On either side of the road was a thick forest, as impenetrable as the darkness just outside of the range of my headlights. I was used to a lack of sleep, but this was starting to get to me. I was chewing gum and listening to the radio. All it picked out was static, but that was better than silence. I had half a thermos of coffee resting on the back seat. I was planning on saving it for later on in the journey, but I had almost forgotten about it. As my eyelids became heavier, I took one hand off the wheel and tried to reach for the flask behind me. Still focusing on the road, I groped for it, but to no avail. My hand brushed past the cold metal, but I couldn't quite seem to grasp it. I exhaled and turned around. I saw the damn thing resting in between the 2 back seats. I reached over a little and grabbed it, and that's when it happened. I saw something streak across my windshield out of my peripheral vision. A great weight struck the car as I span around and stamped my foot on the brake so hard I thought the pedal would buckle under the force. My car came to a screeching halt. I sat there for a minute, my hands holding onto the wheels so hard my knuckles were turning white, and I tried to get my breathing under control. I thought about driving on and not looking back, happy to think I had just hit an unfortunate deer and left it at that. I had hit a deer back in '98. This place was crawling with them, and they seemed almost suicidal, the amount of them that jump in front of cars this time of year. But I decided against that, and racked with anxiety, I got out of my car. Laying on the cold gravel of the road was a body, a human body. I stared in horror as I realized what I had done. His legs were a crumpled mess, his right arm was bent at an impossible angle, and his head. Oh God. His head bore the brunt of the force. It was bisected down the middle. His face was gone, unrecognizable, and clumps of gray matter oozed out from between 2 shards of his skull. The old, black frock jacket he had been wearing was now filled with his blood. My front headlight had shattered. I felt a twinge of guilt checking what damage was done to my car. It should have been the least of my worries, I know. As bad as it is to say, I was planning on leaving the body right there, driving home and forgetting about the night with the help of my good friend Jack Daniels. But then I heard the low rumble of a motor. A car was coming. I was in fight or flight mode, and I did the first thing that made sense at the time. I had an old blanket in the trunk, laid out for my dog when we went to the beach. It stunk of wet dog, but somehow I didn't think the body would mind. I rolled it out in the road and pushed the new corpse onto it as the headlights of the oncoming car neared. The contents of his head were spilling out everywhere, so I grabbed a plastic Target bag and wrapped it around his head, keeping everything in one place. I lifted the body, and to my surprise, he was unusually light. It felt like lifting a small child. I cursed myself for falling in love with a car with such little space in the trunk as I crammed the body inside, closing it just as I was illuminated by a station wagon's headlights. To my horror, it did not keep going. It came to a halt next to me, and the driver started to roll down his window. Instead of accusing me of murder, the tired-looking driver asked me for directions. I saw his wife sitting in the passenger seat. His 3 kids were in the back. All of them were asleep. The man asked me for directions to the nearest motel. The nearest one I could think of was a cheap shithole called Sir Sleep-A-Lot. I had stayed there when my marriage was on the rocks, just before the divorce. I told him he had missed the turn for it, and he had to turn around, drive for 1.5 miles, take a left, then keep driving for another 2 miles. He smiled wearily and thanked me. He started to wind his window back up when he stopped. I was turning back to my car when he asked me if I had broken down and needed any help. I assured him I was fine. He thanked me again and took off into the night. I got back into the driver's seat and just sat there for a while, thinking about what I should do. I must have spent almost an hour, shivering in my seat, weighing my options. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to know how to hide a body, but I didn't think I could stomach dismembering him. But I knew what I had to do. I started my car up and began the last leg of my journey. I passed the moss-covered sign welcoming me back to my hometown. I drove through the empty streets, each house occupied by a sleeping family. I pulled into my street, just on the edge of the suburbs. I realized, for the first time, that my hands were shaking. I tried to get it under control as I parked in my driveway and got out, stretching my weary legs. I made my way to the trunk and opened it. I half hoped the body wouldn't be there, and that this had all been some fever dream I had at the wheel. But of course, it was still there, stained in blood and crumpled into the fetal position. Still wrapped in my dog's blanket and with a plastic bag bearing the Target logo keeping his head in one place. I leaned in to lift him out. As I did, a voice behind me said, with little emotion, "Hello." I whipped around. Standing by his car on the other side of the fence was my neighbor, a religious but sweet guy called Gary. I always saw him as my very own Ned Flanders. I slammed my trunk shut and nonchalantly leaned against it. I greeted him, and we both just stood there awkwardly for what felt like a lifetime. Eventually, Gary said, "Well, see you later," before turning and getting in his car. I stood where I was and watched him drive off until he was out of sight. I wondered what he could be doing at 4:30 in the morning, but it felt weird of me to be suspicious of someone when I was about to bury the body of a man I had just killed. I made sure there were no other nocturnal neighbors around, and I opened my trunk once again. I picked up the strangely light corpse and nudged the trunk shut with my elbow. I hastily walked over to my front door and set the body down, fumbling with my keys. I opened the door and dragged him inside. I pulled him across the carpet, wincing at the mess I had to clean up, and to the basement door. I opened it and gently brought him down the rotting wooden steps. There was a patch of dirt in the corner of my basement where an old washing machine had been. I kept meaning to cement it over, but thankfully never got around to it. I lay the body down next to the dirt patch. I rolled him out of the blanket and got a good look at him for the first time, not that I particularly wanted to. I bunched up the blood-stained blanket and set it down on a workbench I never used. My sister had been looking after my dog Lassie while I was away. I was supposed to pick her up tomorrow, but I didn't fancy the idea of digging up the remains. Since I didn't have a shed, I kept a shovel in the same little room under the stairs where I kept the boiler. As I walked back up the basement stairs, I realized my shake was back. The brevity of what I was about to do was taking hold. I made a B-turn to the kitchen and fumbled with the lock on my liquor cabinet. I took out a half-empty bottle of 90 proof and slumped into an old oak chair, the sole inheritance from my grandfather. Once it was finished, I began to reason with myself. I thought the man I killed might have been the person who was responsible for the recent spate of disappearances. A serial killer who was stalking the backroads late at night, who fell victim to a weary driver. If this was true, then what I had done was a net positive to the world, so I clung to that thought. That's when I heard a noise. It was the type of noise you'd hear as you were drifting off to sleep. The type of noise that tear you back into lucidity. I heard it again. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I put the bottle down and made my way out of the kitchen. I stood in front of the basement door, waiting to see if I could hear it again. I must have stood there for a minute or two in perfect silence. I took a deep breath and grabbed the shovel from the cramped storeroom. Either way, it was time for me to do what needed to be done. With a heavy heart, I opened the door. Standing amongst the shadows at the foot of the stairs was the body. I realized, to my horror, that the noise I heard was the thing's bones snapping back into place. It stood there, staring up at me. It still had the plastic bag over its head, but I could tell it was staring directly into my eyes. I let out a whimper and took a step back. The body let out a shrill scream as its feet left the ground. It floated there for a second as I was frozen from shock. The body jerked and came hurtling up the stairs. I was snapped out of my trance and acted quickly enough to slam the door shut. The force that hit it from the other side shook the hinges. I gritted my teeth, desperately trying to hold the door shut as the body pounded it and snarled from the other side. I looked down at the shovel by my side. I took a hand away from the door to grab it, and as soon as I did, I felt the weight hit me. I almost let it loose from the basement. I grabbed the shovel and wedged it in between the door and the wall behind me. I mustered up enough courage to let go of the door and winced. Thankfully, the shovel was enough to keep it in place. I hopped over the spade, ran past the blood-stained carpet, and stupidly ran past the front door. Instead, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I staggered to my closet and dropped to my knees. I took out the Webley revolver my father gave me when I first moved out. I kept it, along with some loose ammunition wrapped in a piece of tin foil in a shoebox. I hastily loaded it and got to my feet. I held it like I had seen in the detective films. All I know about guns is they shoot. I never learned how to use them properly, never thought I needed to. I made my way down the landing and crouched when I got to the stairs. I warily took 3 steps down to get a view of the basement's entrance. The door was wide open. The shovel had been snapped in half. I raised my gun and pointed at the shadows in the area where I thought the body might be. It felt weird calling it a body, but I didn't know what else to say. I kept my gun level, but heard a noise slowly getting louder. It sounded like a flock of birds landing on the roof. I looked around for its source and saw it. The body was crawling upside down on the ceiling. It had just crawled out of the doorway from the dining room into the living room and was coming straight for me. I stumbled backwards and ran back into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I hid under my bed and held my breath. I heard the body take dull, methodical steps until it stopped directly outside of my door. I fought the urge to scream. From my little hiding spot, I saw my bedroom door slowly creaking open and the body walked in. All I could see of it was its feet, which were clubbed and malformed like a polio victim. Its skin was bone white and dotted with dark purple pustules. Each step looked more painful than the last as it walked around my room. Its breathing was labored and muffled slightly by the plastic bag that it still hadn't taken from its face. I didn't move a muscle. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't think I even breathed. I watched it hobble around my bedroom until it was satisfied I was nowhere to be found. It slowly turned around and walked back out. I stayed where I was for a few minutes, trying desperately to think of what to do next. I calmed myself, got my shaking under control, and rolled out from under the bed. The body was floating in the middle of my room, a meter or so off the ground. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling and looked directly at me. It dived towards me and I fired blindly. I was inexperienced with using a gun, but I was so close to it it was almost impossible to miss. All 5 shots hit their target. The body faltered in the air and slammed into my bedside cabinet. I got to my feet and scrambled to my door. I looked back to see the body convulsing. I ran in abject terror and made my way down the stairs in a controlled fall. I hadn't even reached the ground floor before the body came hurtling out of my room, flying through the air as if something had thrown it. I grabbed my keys from the little ceramic bowl by the front door and fumbled with them until I found the right one. I burst out of my house and ran frantically down the driveway to my car. I opened the door and fell into the driver's seat. When I looked up, I saw the body standing in the doorway of my house. It slowly reached for its face and ripped the plastic shopping bag off. I wish it hadn't. The body flung itself at the car, just as I got the engine going. It latched onto the hood and let out a guttural cry as it started to violently headbutt the windscreen. I pulled into the street and drove blindly into the night. Cracks appeared on the glass and I feared it would shatter. Its forehead was bleeding now, but it didn't seem to care. It was then I got a good look at its face. Its skin was a tallow white, with the mottled texture of chronic rheumatism. Its eyes were pure black, bulging from its head as if they were to fall out and leaking vile pus from the edges. Its nose and ears looked like they had been gnarled off by a rabid dog, leaving only scared, shapeless stumps. The thing's gums were necrotic, its teeth were shattered and ripping through exposed nerves. All but the front canines, which seemed dagger-like and immaculate. I hit the brakes. The body flew from the hood and skidded across the tarmac road, degloving any exposed skin as it slid, leaving a trail of blood behind it. I revved my car before driving over the body for the second time that night. I stopped and collected myself. I took a deep breath in and another out. I held the steering wheel tightly and focused my mind. As I was calming myself, I saw something move from out of the corner of my eye. I looked in the wing mirror to see the body slowly rise to its feet. I turned around in my seat and stared slack-jawed at it. It looked back at me before dropping to all fours. I watched as it scurried down the street to my house. It looked back at me one more time as it stood up and calmly walked into my home, the front door slamming shut behind it. At this point, a few neighbors had woken up. From the sirens in the distance, I knew at least one had phoned 911. I drove to the outskirts of town, parked up the bridge, and slept for the first time in what felt like a week. I woke up to a teenager banging on my door, laughing as I jolted awake and running off to continue his walk to school. On a tank of fumes, I made my way to my sister's. I write to you now from her guest room, my dog Lassie curled up at my feet. I planned on going back to my house. My sister had convinced me that most of what happened that night was just a weird experience with a crackhead. It wasn't until writing this all down did I realize how bullshit of an excuse that is. I bought a telescope to watch the stars. One of them started moving impossibly every night, drawing the same shapes. I finally know what they mean. Hello, everyone. Never thought I would do this, but I need to talk. I need someone to know what I know, even if they won't believe me. I'm a normal guy, just like everyone else. My life is very ordinary. Work, then home, maybe a bit too much solitude. The only thing that gives me a sense of comfort or escape from this monotony is the sky. Ever since I was a child, I've loved looking at the stars. It's a strange feeling, looking at things millions of light years away, things our ancestors saw, and perhaps generations long after us will see. It makes you feel incredibly small, but also part of something immensely larger. About a year ago, I decided to take this interest to another level. I saved up and bought a telescope. Not exactly professional grade, but a decent one. It magnifies the view and lets me see more details on the moon, nearby planets, and sometimes distant star clusters or faint nebulae if the sky is clear. Most nights, I go up to our building's rooftop, as far away from the street noise and city lights as I can manage. I sit there for hours in the quiet of the night, the sound of the cool breeze just focused on the telescope's eyepiece. The whole world disappears, leaving only me and the tiny point of light I'm observing. Many nights passed in the same routine. I'd align the telescope to a specific region of the sky and just contemplate. Sometimes I'd look at Jupiter and its faint rings, other times at Mars with its distinct red hue, and often I'd just get lost in the endless sea of stars. I used to feel a strange peace, a peace I couldn't find anywhere else. Until one night about 2 months ago, that night changed everything. I was on the rooftop as usual. The weather was nice, the sky relatively clear. I had an eyepiece attached that gave me a slightly wider field of view, wanting to scan an area dense with stars. As I slowly moved the telescope, I noticed something odd. A point of light like an ordinary star, but it wasn't stationary. At first, I thought maybe my hand had shaken, or perhaps it was a very distant aircraft. I focused harder. No, not an airplane. Airplanes follow straight or gently curved paths, and they have blinking lights. This was a steady point of light, just like a star, but it was moving. And it wasn't moving like the satellites we sometimes see crossing the sky at a constant speed in a straight line. No, this thing was moving in a way that was impossible. It was making sharp, acute angles, stopping abruptly, then shooting off in another direction at high speed, only to slow down again and trace something like a strange geometric shape. Initially, I thought I might be hallucinating. Maybe my eyes were strained from focusing too long. I pulled my eye away from the eyepiece, looked up at the sky directly. Of course, I saw nothing but the familiar, fixed stars. I returned to the telescope, aimed it at the same region. There it was, still there, still moving in that same crazy manner. My heart started beating faster. What was this? A spy satellite. But what kind of satellite performs these kinds of aerobatics? A drone? What drone could reach that altitude and appear like a star? My mind raced, searching for any logical explanation, anything to hold on to. I found nothing. I kept tracking it with my eye and the telescope for about an hour. It was tracing bizarre shapes in a small patch of the sky. Complex patterns, like intersecting lines, curves, and sharp angles, then suddenly it would vanish or move so fast I'd lose it. I came down from the rooftop feeling a mixture of shock, anxiety, and intense curiosity. I didn't know what I had just seen. I spent the whole night thinking. Could it be a rare optical phenomenon, a specific light reflection, a problem with the telescope itself? But the telescope worked perfectly fine with all the other stars and planets. And this phenomenon was very specific, localized to that single point. The next day, I went up to the rooftop a bit earlier, before the time I'd seen the phenomenon. I was tense, expectant. Same area of the sky, same telescope settings. And indeed, at roughly the same time, it appeared again. The same point of light, the same impossible movements. This time, I was more focused. I tried to follow its path meticulously. It was tracing the exact same shapes I had seen the night before. Not similar shapes, no, precisely the same ones. The same angles, the same pauses, the same speeds. This is where it went beyond coincidence or natural phenomena, or even a conventional satellite. Something tracing the same complex pattern every night in the same spot at the same time. This wasn't natural. This was intentional. A faint sense of dread started creeping into me. The idea of aliens or UFOs had always been just science fiction and movies to me. I never seriously considered it. But what I was seeing had no earthly explanation I could logically arrive at. If it wasn't aliens in a craft, then what? The third night, I went up armed with a notebook and pen. I started observing the point as it moved, trying my best to sketch the path it was taking. It was incredibly difficult. The movement was fast, the shapes complex, and my hand wasn't steady enough. But I was determined. I drew jagged lines, dots, angles, trying to capture any part of this pattern. Every night, I went up and drew. Every night, the same movements repeated with the same meticulous precision. I began comparing the drawings from different nights. The same sequence, the same strange geometric figures. It wasn't just movement anymore. It felt more like a message being written across the sky. But a message from whom, and why, and what did it mean? The first week passed like this. I became obsessed. My work started to suffer, my sleep dwindled. During the day, I'd think about what I saw at night, and at night, I was perched on the rooftop, fixated on that moving point of light. I started feeling utterly alone in the world, holding a secret nobody knew, and nobody would likely believe if I told them. I considered telling a friend once. We were sitting at a cafe, and I was very hesitant. Finally, I vaguely hinted that I was seeing strange things in the sky with my telescope. He looked at me and said, "Man, you must be seeing things. Maybe it's just a plane or a satellite and you're making a big deal out of it." I tried to explain that the movement wasn't normal, that it repeated, but he just laughed and said, "All right, man, next time film it and show us." The idea of filming it had occurred to me, of course. I tried recording with my phone camera through the telescope eyepiece, but the image came out extremely shaky and unclear, and the point of light was so small it barely showed up as a pixel or two moving erratically in the video. There was no solid physical proof I could present. I went back to the notebook and pen. Every night, I added a new piece to the drawing, like assembling a large, complex puzzle. I started noticing that these shapes weren't just random lines. There was repetition, a certain symmetry. Like a strange visual language, I would stare at these drawings for hours, trying to understand them. Was it a map? Chemical symbols, the design for some machine. Time passed, and I still didn't understand anything. The feeling of helplessness grew. I was witnessing something happening right before my eyes every night, something that could potentially be the most important discovery in human history, and I couldn't comprehend it or report it to anyone convincingly. The fear began to evolve. It wasn't just fear of the unknown anymore. It became fear of what this message might actually be saying. If it was a message, who was sending it with such power that it barely appeared as a moving star? And what level of importance or danger would warrant such an effort? I started searching online for anything similar. Amateur astronomy forums, conspiracy theory websites, anything. I found no description matching what I was seeing. Everything was either mundane sightings of satellites or planes or clearly fabricated videos. What I was seeing was different. It was real, persistent, and terrifyingly organized. Over time, the drawing in my notebook started to take shape. I now had a complete sequence of the movements the point made over about an hour and a half each night. An incredibly complex drawing filled with minute details. I'd look at it, feeling like the key was right in front of me, but I couldn't find the door. One night, as I was looking at the drawing, comparing it to the previous nights to ensure accuracy, I noticed something. In a specific part of the drawing, there seemed to be a certain ratio that repeated between the lengths of particular lines and specific angles. A mathematical ratio, something like the golden ratio, perhaps, but much more complex. I thought to myself, wait a minute, what if these aren't visual symbols in the traditional sense? What if they're equations? What if it's the language of mathematics? They call mathematics the language of the universe. Maybe whoever is sending this message knows that the only way to communicate with any other civilization, regardless of their language or form, is through mathematical constants and logic. This idea sent a shiver down my spine. If this was math, then I needed someone who understood highly complex mathematics to decipher it. My education is average. My highest level of math was in high school. But this idea opened a new door. I began focusing on the drawing from a mathematical perspective, looking for numerical patterns for known constants like pi, or Euler's number E. It was like trying to crack an impossible code. I spent days and nights trying to apply the simple math I knew, searching online for advanced mathematical concepts that might relate to these shapes. Chaos theory, fractal geometry, things I'd never even heard of before. I felt like a blind person feeling their way through a dark maze. Every time I felt I was getting close to something, I'd hit a dead end. But I didn't give up. The feeling that the answer was near, that this message had meaning, was stronger than any frustration. To avoid suspicion or questions about the source of these shapes, I started using a tactic. I joined specialized math forums online, presenting small fragments of the drawing as abstract mathematical problems or geometric puzzles I was trying to solve as a hobby. I framed them in a context completely removed from astronomy or anything unusual. The reactions were mixed. Many people said they were just meaningless scribbles with no clear mathematical significance. Others tried to find patterns, but arrived at illogical conclusions. However, a small minority, likely academics or people deeply versed in pure mathematics, were intrigued by the complexity and symmetry in these shapes. They began discussing hypotheses, talking about the possibility that they represented a specific type of complex mathematical function or an unconventional mathematical system. I followed these discussions eagerly, gathering any information, any thread that might lead me somewhere. I started understanding new terminology, learning about branches of mathematics I didn't know existed, and I began applying these ideas to the complete drawing I possessed. Slowly, gradually, the picture began to clear. It wasn't just a single equation. It was a series of interconnected mathematical equations and concepts layered on top of each other. Each part of the drawing represented a variable, a constant, or a specific calculation. It was a purely mathematical language, completely abstract, devoid of any form of spoken or written language we know. I spent several more weeks on this painstaking work, connecting the parts, trying to find the logic governing the sequence. It felt like solving the hardest equation of my life. And the closer I got to the solution, the more the fear inside me grew, because I started sensing the nature of the message. It wasn't a message of welcome, nor a map to a cosmic treasure, nor the design for a devastating weapon. It carried a sense of urgency and of pain, until I reached the crucial moment. After long nights of sleeplessness, concentration, and calculations, aided by online tools and the discussions on the specialized forums I interacted with very cautiously, I managed to piece it all together. I was able to translate this mathematical message into a concept that we humans could grasp. The result was simpler and more horrifying than anything I could have possibly imagined. The message wasn't coming from a spacecraft orbiting this star, nor from a civilization living on a planet orbiting it. The message was coming from the star itself. I don't understand how, and I don't know if this is scientifically possible or not. Can stars possess consciousness? Can they be living beings in a way completely different from our understanding of life? I don't know, and that's not the important part right now. What matters is the content of the message. All those complex geometric shapes and impossible movements, when translated from the abstract, universal language of mathematics, conveyed one simple, terrifying meaning. A meaning understandable to any living being anywhere in the universe that might have reached a certain level of understanding of the fundamental laws of physics and mathematics. The equations described a specific physical state, a state of rapid, unexpected internal collapse, a state of imminent stellar death. And the final message, the culmination of all these movements, was the mathematical equivalent of a simple phrase composed of two core concepts: help request, imminent end/death, or simply in human terms, help us, we are dying. I sat there, staring at the notebook at the final equation, frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. The coldness I felt in that moment wasn't from the rooftop air. It came from the depths of the cosmos itself. A dying star, a conscious star, or at least one capable of communication somehow, sending a distress call across the vast expanse of space. A plea written in the language of mathematics so that anyone might understand it. And that someone was me, an ordinary young man sitting on a rooftop in a distant country with a modest telescope. I was the one who cracked the code. I was the one who heard the scream. A scream that had been traveling for how many light years to reach here? Tens, hundreds, thousands, millions. Where exactly is this star? Is it even still there? Or is this just an echo of a voice that died long, long ago? And what could I possibly do? Who am I to help a dying star? What help could I offer? Even if I knew its exact location, even if I notified every space agency in the world, what would they do? Send a spaceship that would take millions of years to arrive. And if it arrived, what could it possibly do? The sense of absolute helplessness was crushing. The feeling of cosmic loneliness became deeper, more terrifying. We aren't just small in this universe, we are also frighteningly powerless. We hear the cries for help from our cosmic neighbors, and we can do absolutely nothing. That night, after deciphering the code, I went back up to the rooftop. I pointed the telescope at the same spot. The point of light was still there. still tracing the same complex geometric shapes in the cold silence of space, still sending the same desperate message. Help us. We are dying. This time, I wasn't looking at it with curiosity or fear of the unknown. I was looking at it with profound sadness and a terrible sense of guilt. I knew. I understood, and I could do nothing. The sky, where I used to find peace and escape, had transformed for me into a vast graveyard filled with stars dying in silence, or screaming pleas for help that no one hears, or those who hear cannot answer. Every night now, I go up to the rooftop, not to enjoy the stars, but because I honestly don't know why. Maybe to bear witness. Maybe so that this scream doesn't just echo into the void completely alone. I sit and watch this point as it draws its message of death, knowing that a real star, a massive entity perhaps the size of our sun or larger, is collapsing and crying for help somewhere far away in the darkness. The biggest problem is that a realization like this changes everything. How can I go back to living my ordinary life knowing what I know? How can I care about trivial problems of work, money, and relationships when I know that beings the size of stars are pleading for help in the universe around us? I still go up to the rooftop every night, and the point of light still traces the same pattern, the same equation. The same scream, help us, we are dying. And I don't know what to do, and I don't know if there's anyone else, anywhere else in this universe, seeing the same message and feeling the same helplessness that I feel right now. Just the thought that this message might be traced across the skies of other planets, before the eyes of other beings, each one standing alone, as helpless as I am. That thought makes me want to scream, but I hold it in, and I just keep watching in silence. Maybe that's all I can do. Cherished memories. At 25 years old, I'm finally moving out. Technically, this is the second time I've moved out of my parents' house. I tried college for all of 6 months before dropping out and moving back home. I spent the next few years picking up odd jobs and languishing around the house. Now, I finally have a healthy mix of earning, loans, and inheritance that will allow me to start renting a broom closet-sized apartment in the middle of town. The past few days have been spent rummaging through boxes, taking a trip down memory lane and seeing if there was any part of my childhood worth salvaging, worth bringing with me through the next chapter of my life. I dragged an old, dust-covered cardboard box down from the attic. It had my name written on it in Sharpie. My mother's eyes lit up when she saw it. She explained that it was a box of cherished memories, mementos from when I was younger. I opened it up, and we both spent the afternoon looking through its contents. And old Teddy, a jar of my milk teeth, an art piece or two, and countless other sentimental knickknacks. At the very bottom was a leather-bound photo album. On the front was written, "First 7 years." My mother took it out and placed it gently on her lap. She started skimming through the pages, staring lovingly at each faded Polaroid picture of me. There was one of me at the park, one of me at Chuck E. Cheese on my 6th birthday, crying in the embrace of some furred mouse. My mother found one particularly cute. She slid it out of its plastic cover and handed it to me. It was a picture of me when I was 7. I was covered head to toe in a nasty chickenpox rash. To cheer me up, my father had stuck a dozen or so red circular stickers to my favorite teddy bear so I didn't feel alone. I smiled at the picture, its colors already beginning to dull. I asked my mother if I could bring it with me, and she said of course. A few weeks later, I was fully moved into my new place. The walls were damp, there was a peculiar mold spreading behind the radiator, and my next-door neighbor would play classic at an absurdly high volume in the early hours of the morning. Apart from that, it was perfect. I was renting, sure, but it was someplace I could call my own. I didn't bring all that much, nothing that couldn't fit into 2 boxes. For furniture, I had a mattress, a poorly constructed IKEA bookshelf, and an old oak closet that my mother made me bring. I think she was just trying to get rid of it, judging by the noticeable wood rot. I had finally finished unpacking everything and was going to throw the boxes away when I noticed something laying at the bottom of one of them. It was the Polaroid. I picked it up and held it in my hands. I stopped what I was doing and fell back onto the mattress, staring at the picture. There was something about it, As I looked at it, I got a niggling feeling that I had forgotten something. I was 7 again. I remembered back to the night before I got the outbreak of chickenpox. I already felt ill. Not a rash yet, just a stomach ache and a mild fever. I had woken up in the middle of the night. My parents slept in separate rooms, and my mother's was directly across from mine. Every time I fell ill or just had a nightmare, I would go into my mother's room to find comfort. This night was no different. Creeping through the dark corridor, even only for a split second, took some building up to. I remember standing in the darkness of my room for what must have been 5 whole minutes before finally being courageous enough to open the door and step out. I did, and quickly made my way into my mother's. I walked to her beside, put a gentle hand out her shoulder and shook her awake. Dazed, she asked me what was wrong. I explained to her that I was sick. She sighed, in a loving way, and let me clamber into bed with her. I remember how comforting a mother's embrace is. It's like all the ills of the world melt away. I stayed there for a minute or two before she asked me if I was feeling better. I told her I did, and she sat up in bed, handing me the glass of water she keeps by her bedside. Once I finished it, she told me to go back to bed. She said that she would pop in 10 minutes to check on me. She kissed me goodnight, and I made the traitorous journey back to my room. I jumped into bed, making sure to keep a fair distance from the flood so nothing could reach out and grab my foot. I tucked myself in and waited for my mother to come, to see if I was all right and hopefully to tell me that I could stay off school tomorrow. Just as I was about to turn around and finally go back to sleep, my door opened. I turned around but couldn't make out who was there in the darkness. As the figure came closer, I was sure that it was my mother, not that I could see. She didn't say anything, but neither did I. She stood over my bed and did nothing. She stood there for maybe a minute, although I can't remember it clearly. She didn't move a muscle while she stood there. All I could hear was her breathing, which seemed raspy and labored. Then, she reached her hand down and brushed it against my cheek. My face was peeping out from just behind the quilt covers, and I felt like retreating further behind them when it touched me. Her hand felt cold. So cold. As quickly as my mother came in, she left. I heard her move away from me, but I couldn't be sure as it was almost pitch black. I was peeved that I didn't get my usual kiss on the cheek, but nonetheless I turned over and let sleep take me. Come to think of it, I never heard my bedroom door close again. The next morning I got up for my usual breakfast of Cheerios, starting to feel itchy as the chickenpox took full effect. I sat at the kitchen table, and my mother slid a bowl of cereal in front of me. She saw how irritated I was and poured me a glass of water. Accompanying it was a small white pill. Some mild painkiller, I assume, but back then, I thought all pills were a cure for something, so I quickly took it. My mother realized what was wrong with me and rang the doctors, arranging a checkup for that afternoon. She sat back down next to me and took my free hand in hers. She told me with a smile that I could forget about going into school today, and I beamed back at her. The kettle whistled, and she got up to pour the tea. Her back turned, she told me that she had to apologize for something. She assured me that she meant to check up on me, but she fell asleep right after I went back to bed last night. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the Polaroid in my hand, the memory suddenly as vivid as the day it happened. My mother hadn't come to check on me that night after all. So who had? A chill ran down my spine as the realization set in. I had always believed that it was her in the room with me, but the more I thought about it, the less certain I became. I could still feel that cold, unfamiliar touch on my cheek, the way it made my skin crawl even though I'd wanted it to be comforting. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease that had settled in my chest. It was just an old memory, distorted by time and a child's imagination. I was alone now, in my own place, and the only thing I had to be scarred about was missing rent. I placed the Polaroid on the small bookshelf, leaning it against a stack of books so I could see it from where I lay on the mattress. The faded image of my younger self smiled back at me, oblivious to the strange presence that had visited that night. I turned off the light and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin just like I used to. The room was quiet, save for the muffled sounds of my neighbor's music seeping through the walls. I closed my eyes and tried to shake off the remnants of the memory, reminding myself that I was safe. The past was behind me. Just as drifted off to sleep, I felt something. A hand, ice cold and skeletal, gently caressed my cheek. I sat bolt upright in bed. I flailed around in movements that could be vaguely described as self-defense, but my hands hit nothing. I grabbed my phone and turned on the torch, lighting up my room. I was alone. There was no boogeyman to be found, and I laughed at my own stupidity, at letting my imagination get the better of me. I got up and walked to the little bookshelf. I picked my picture and stared at myself smiling, thinking that despite it all, I really haven't changed much since then. That's when I saw it. Standing just behind me was something that hadn't been in that Polaroid this morning. There was a woman, draped in stained rags and rotting, half covered in underexposed shadow. Her hand was brushing against my rosy cheek. I dropped the photo to the floor. My breath faltered as I turned around and collapsed onto the mattress. I wrapped myself in the duvet and tried to get to sleep. I ignored what I had just seen. I ignored the sound of my closet door creaking open. That's all for tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you'll be here for the next collection. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Share in the comments which story stood out to you most. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care in the dark.